It's the latest sign that he may have survived the worst and is now here to stay. That's why Bashar al Assad's forces continue to press the offensive while ignoring ceasefires like this one in Sweden. Rebels say they have shot down a Syrian regime jet here, hours after Damascus captured territory in the region. It happens as Assad's position continues to strengthen and the international coalition pushes for a complete end to hostilities.
When two superpowers, Russian Federation, which is an ally of President Assad, and the United States of America agree fundamentally at that level in trying to make that ceasefire work, there is a strong chance that that will take place.
That's emboldened Assad's regime to go on the offensive. They might want to recapture as much territory as possible before any deal is reached, as any arrangement could partition the country. But such rapprochement with Assad has led to an outcry among the moderate rebel groups.
When we heard the announcement of the tripartite deal between the Americans, Russians and Jordanians, which orders the withdrawal from the southwest of Hauran or the southern Syria area in general, honestly, we hoped this fulfills the goals which we called for. The battle cry "death over humiliation" that erupted aims to liberate our land from our enemy, Assad.
The Syrian leader is more than happy to oblige. Here, destruction by barrel bombs, and there the use of munitions that gas civilians to death. It's a remarkable comeback for a man whose writ was reduced to the outskirts of Damascus. That was in late 2012, a year and a half after a military crackdown turned Arab Spring protests in Syria into an armed insurgency. But timely support from Russia and Iran ensured that he survived and managed to push back the strongest rebel offensives, and finally routed them in Aleppo.
How can you liberate the civilians in those areas from the terrorists? Is it better to leave them under their supervision, under their oppression, under their fate defined by those terrorists, by beheading, by killing, by everything, but not having state? Is that the role of the state, just to keep and watch? You have to liberate, and this is the price sometimes, but at the end, the people are liberated from the terrorists.
That price comes at the cost of 11 million Syrians having fled their homes and more than 250,000 dead. That's something Assad appears to be at peace with, as the rest of the world falls in line. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Cardiff by Syria analyst Ayman Jawad Tamimi, and in London, Alexander Nekrasov. He's a former advisor to the Kremlin. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Ayman Tamimi, if I can begin with you, sir, is Assad as strong as ever?
Yes. I definitely say so. I mean, he is as strong as ever. He controls the most important urban centers in Syria, most of Damascus, Homs and Aleppo city, not to mention the coastal cities of Latakia and Tartus. Whereas the opposition, so to speak, only has Idlib and parts of Deraa, these isolated pockets in the north and south of the country. And so, you know, if it's a question of who controls most important assets in the country, the choice between the opposition and Assad, then of course it's Assad. So definitely his position is as strong as ever. And I think that over time, also with this new ceasefire, it'll help solidify things even more if the ceasefire holds. I mean, for example, Assad and his allies could divert some manpower from the south, say, and help bolster even more the push eastwards towards the borders of Iraq and into the Deir ez-Zor province, the oil-rich province of Syria, you know, backed both by Russia and Iran in this regard. Russia with airstrikes chiefly, and Iran with supplying both client militiamen and also some ground personnel.
Okay, Alexander Nekrasov, is Assad's strong position right now all down to Russian and Iranian support?
Of course it is, because take out the Russian troops and the Iranian troops and support, and that's it. Assad is finished. But I think that this latest ceasefire, it practically doesn't change anything. It was obviously negotiated for that meeting between Trump and Putin in Germany, and they wanted to have some sort of a result coming out of it. I don't really see that it will hold. I suspect it's not even holding already. Now I can tell you something a bit of an exclusive. A team of Russian independent journalists have just returned from Syria, and they showed me some of the footage they have done on the ground in different parts of Syria and in some of the small towns besieged by ISIS fighters and so on. So what I have seen there is that supplies are continuing to come to the ISIS fighters. The reinforcements are coming still. So how can we say that things are changing in Syria and that Assad is strengthening his position when some countries are continuing their support and we don't know which ones are doing that?
If I may ask you, Mr. Nekrasov, which towns and cities were you looking at in that footage?
Well, I can't tell you now because I didn't pay attention to the names. One of the cities has 100,000 people in it, and they are besieged by ISIS. They have only 2 helicopters that bring in supplies, and ISIS are basically waiting to storm it, and they're promising to kill everyone.
But how do you know it's ISIS?
This footage will be released. Sorry?
How do you know it's ISIS?
No, they've been inside. They've been inside. They filmed from the air. They filmed everything. So the people inside the town told them stories of horrific slaughter and so on. So it's not something that I've made up. It's caught on camera.
I'm just trying to sort of pass this out. I mean, you say they were Russian independent journalists. Independent how? I mean, were they affiliated with anyone or they're completely independent?
No, they're independent journalists. They make this footage and they sell it to companies that would like to buy it, basically. So that they have nothing to do with any governments or anything. So these are just people who make money out of this footage.
Okay, so that's something interesting coming from Alexander Nekrasov. He's a man who's connected. Ayman, does that sound plausible to you that Daesh in Syria is still getting support from somewhere?
I'll just comment on 2 things. In terms of the siege situation he's talking about Deir ez-Zor city, which is the parts of it still held by the regime. Yeah, they are being besieged by the Islamic State. And I think around 100,000 people, that's probably an accurate number. What seems less plausible, though, is this idea of still getting supplies from unnamed foreign states. I think the problem in the Deir ez-Zor area is that, you know, there's still border connections between Iraq and Syria that the Islamic State can move through and move personnel and move weapons they still have. In terms of access to, you know, say, weapons from the international black market or things like this, or from the outside world, this is much more restricted now because the Islamic State no longer has any access to the border with Turkey. They were driven off it by Syrian rebel forces backed by Turkey back in the summer of 2016.
Right. So, Ayman, I want to bring up the point of Syrian rebel forces. And Alexander Nekrasov, I know this is where you and Ayman will disagree about who's a rebel and who's not. And Mr. Nekrasov, we've had a ding-dong about this multiple times about who's a moderate rebel and who's not. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole again. But Ayman, if we take, say, Daesh, ISIS, and Jabhat Fatah Sham, the former Nusra Front, let's park them off to the side. All the other rebel forces, those who are currently fighting right now, besides those groups, who's supporting them? Which countries are supporting them? Or have they been abandoned by the international community?
No, they have a variety of different international backers, and then there's the question of, well, what's the scale of the support and what is the country backing them have in mind when they give that support to that group. So if we take the South, which is, of course, in terms of what we're talking about with the ceasefire, the main backers there is the Jordan, Gulf states, and some Western countries through an operations room in Amman. And it's to a very broad coalition of groups known as the Southern Front, or they go by the label of Free Syrian Army as well. But as far as we're talking about with this coalition and what the international backers want, it's not really, you know, let's use this force in the south to push on Damascus and overthrow Assad. On the contrary, it's far more, I think at best you can call it conflict calibration. You know, where it's trying to prevent one side from, it seems, from gaining a decisive victory for fear, for example, that you'll create lots of more refugee flows into Jordan.
Right. Ayman, was that, sorry to interrupt you, was that because the Russians, sorry to interrupt you, was that because the Russians and the Iranians forced or imposed their will on this conflict over the past few months?
I would say, actually, when you take the case of the South and Jordan, this is a thing that's been a lot more long-term than, say, the decisive gains that Assad has made in the past year or so. Jordan, I think, for a long time was not too keen on the idea of a push from the south to take Damascus by the rebels, because they were very concerned about refugee flows. Then when we take Israel, another country that gives select backing to some more independent groups in the border of the Golan Heights, that too is also about conflict calibration, trying to prevent the Iranians and their clients from having free access to the border of the Golan Heights, while at the same time Israel doesn't want Druze communities in the Quneitra area to be endangered by some of the rebel groups. So again, it seems to be in the south about conflict calibration, rather than backing one side for a decisive victory.
Alexander Nekrasov, the last time I spoke to you about this, Donald Trump had bombed Syrian regime positions after the Syrians had used chemical attacks or chemical weapons against their own people. There was a suggestion then that the United States was going to be muscly and aggressive against the Syrian regime. Since then, Trump hasn't done much. He seems to have been in lockstep with Russia. Did you expect all of this to happen? And what does this say now? What does this say about the American view of this conflict?
Well, first of all, in Moscow, they are still puzzled what is exactly the American position on Syria, because just days before the meeting in Hamburg between Putin and Trump, the Americans started peddling this idea that Assad is planning another chemical attack, and they were hinting they were going to strike the regime again. And this came out of nowhere. The Russians were totally taken aback by that. And then, of course, different sort of signals are coming from Washington all the time.
But maybe they had intel, right?
Assad has to go.
But Mr. Nekrasov, maybe they had intel that he might have wanted to, and he didn't, right?
Well, you might say that, but it all sounded very unconvincing. But it also sounds very, you know, sort of confusing for Moscow, because there is no practical policy. I think, my personal opinion, I think that Trump's administration wants Russia to sink in further in the conflict in Syria. I think that's the general line, although they are playing this game of we are going to fight together against IS and so on. That is what is happening, and Russia is trying to basically find a solution like we saw in Astana talks and all those de-escalation zones, which won't work, unfortunately. Russia is trying to find a formula when it can start pulling out its troops. It doesn't want to get bogged down in another type of Afghanistan. America is actually not allowing Russia to leave. And that is the situation we're witnessing now.
You say the Russians want to leave.
Between Trump, I think they want to leave. I want any country would want to leave such a conflict. And unfortunately, the meeting in Hamburg on the sidelines between Trump and Putin didn't really, you know, reveal any solutions or any, you know, sort of narrowing of positions between the two countries.
Right. Let's go to Ayman. Ayman, the battle for Raqqa. As many of us expect, now that Mosul has been retaken by the Iraqi army, Daesh has been kicked out there in Iraq, There seems to be the suggestion that Raqqa's next and that there's a hope that Daesh will be ousted from Raqqa. How likely is that, Ayman? And would that be overall a good thing in this conflict?
Okay, I think it is likely that they would be ousted from Raqqa. And to be sure, I think the Islamic State's own messaging has been trying to address that possibility, and even to the point of conceding that it will happen in their messaging since, around, say, May of 2016, last year, when their spokesman put out his last speech, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, before he was killed in August 2016. But in May 2016, he put out a speech where he did say he mocked to the US idea, or the supposed US idea, that losing Raqqa, Mosul, and then Sirte in Libya would mean the end of the Islamic State as a caliphate project. So yeah, I do think it's going to happen, and the Islamic State's own messaging seems to be partly addressing that. Whether it's a good thing, it really just does depend on how the city is administered afterwards.
Right.
I think the challenge foremost is to have, credible, representative local governance in the city.
Right. Yeah, and looking at who is doing that, taking over the city or fighting Daesh, you have the SDF, of which a large part is the YPG, considered by Turkey as a terrorist organization. They've got weapons from the Americans. The Americans say once they go in and they destroy Daesh, the YPG has promised them they'll give them their weapons back. So, Ayman, is the general who writes up these talking points a comedian, or do the Americans really believe that the YPG is going to hand the weapons back and they're just going to retreat back to their old positions?
To be honest, I think the American messaging tends to be very, very confused about this. And in the same way, for example, when they've tried to say the YPG is not linked to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and they've tried to say, well, there's no link, and there's proof it's not the case. But it's really to the point almost of insulting Turkey in this regard. That the fact is that the YPG is basically the Syrian affiliate of the PKK. And I don't think they'd want to give their weapons back to the Americans either. In the end, the YPG really, or its political wing, the PYD, in most of the towns that have been taken, they're the ones who hold the keys of power, so to speak. And in turn, this is people who are PKK cadres, essentially. And in terms of how they'll strike their regional alliances, it really just depends on what the situation is. If they think the Americans abandon them, I'm sure they'll strike many more deals with the Syrian regime in Russia. Yeah,
it's set to further complicate the situation in northern Syria. Gentlemen, it's been good to have this discussion. Ayman Jawad Tamimi and Alexander Nekrasov, thank you very much for joining us.